Hello and welcome to the 20th episode of A Woman Robbed, a bonus series of And the Runner-Up Is, where we talk about actresses who may have come close to earning Oscar nominations but were ultimately overlooked or omitted, or for one reason or another just didn't have the votes to make it into the final lineup, and discussing why they may have deserved to get in and why they ultimately didn't. Each episode has its own theme, and this week, we're going to be covering two performances from the 2000s that did not earn Oscar nominations. And my guest today is, for my money, one of the best writers about film out there right now. I love his deep dives, especially about actresses, obviously. He's joined me for multiple Best Actress episodes, including for 2004, which we'll be revisiting later on. Now he's back talking about even more performances from the 2000s. From the film experience, welcome back to the show, Cláudio Alves.
Hi, thank you for having me back, and thank you for your kind words. They're really appreciated. Um,
Yeah, you're very good at what you do. Whenever I read your Almost There series, especially what you've done for quite a few years now, I am always like kind of blown away by your analysis. So
I
yeah,
could say the same about listening to your podcast, to be perfectly honest.
thank you. I appreciate that as well. Well, I think we should get right into it. So I
Mm.
presented to my patrons here, and the runner-up is a list of 15 of the most notable performances of the 2000s that were not nominated, and the choices were, to recap, Amy Adams in Enchanted, Joan Allen in The Upside of Anger, Bjork in Dancer in the Dark, Julie Delpy in Before Sunset, Laura Dern in Inland Empire, Sally Hawkins in Happy Go Lucky, Isabelle Huppert in The Piano Teacher, Scarlett Johansson in Lost in Translation, Nicole Kidman in Birth, Tilda Swinton in Julia, Uma Thurman in Kill Bill Volume 1 and 2, Kate Winslet in Revolutionary Road, Reese Witherspoon in Legally Blonde, Michelle Yeoh in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and Zhang Ji in Memoirs of a Geisha. So, tough competition there, but the top vote getters were, in fact, Isabelle Huppert and Uma Thurman. This was a very close vote. Nicole Kidman in Birth was very, very close to slipping into that top two, but sadly did not make it in. But yeah, this was Huppert and Thurman all the way. Well done, patrons. Very excited to talk about these two, especially with you, Cláudio. But first, let's talk about the 2000s overall in film. Curious your relationship with this particular decade in film and with actresses, especially in Hollywood or otherwise. Just any overall feelings you want to mention before we get into it.
I mean, the 2000s obviously mean a lot to me, just because of my age automatically, because I am going to be 31 this year. So my film obsession started during this decade. And I can remember vividly when I started following the Oscars around 2006. And so, like, a lot of my cinephilia feels connected to this decade. Even I wouldn't call it my favorite decade of cinema, but it is probably the most influential in terms of what sort of film lover I am today. And some of the actresses, of course, that I love the most dominated this decade. When I think of the 2000s, I immediately think, for example, of Tilda Swinton, who I remember seeing in Chronicles of Narnia as a kid, but then because of the Oscars, I saw her in Michael Clayton and was sort of obsessed and started to investigate the rest of her career. And by the time Julia came about in 2009, I was a devotee and just wanted to see as much things as possible. And Nicole Kidman, which was also in the running here, I love that you mentioned Birth, which I watched at probably too young an age to appreciate it the first time, but this is a recurring thing in this conversation because I also watched The Piano Teacher for the first time at probably too young an age to fully appreciate it. But yeah, I can't really even start to conceive what my relationship with cinema would be without thinking about my relationship with 2000s cinema. So yeah, it's a very important decade, and probably, and my favorite film of the decade is Moulin Rouge for those interested.
Wow.
Nicole Kidman all the way.
Yeah, love it. Yeah, we're pretty similar in that. Definitely the 2000s hold a special place in my heart because this is when I grew up and really started to appreciate movies, as an art form rather than just as entertainment. It's kind of a tough decade to sum up, I find, though, because it does feel like a point where, like, we had such a monoculture in the 90s. I think of like Titanic and all the big epics of that decade that kind of brought people together. I feel like we're starting to splinter off a little bit once we get to the 2000s. We have the superhero craze and all that with the Spider-Mans and the X-Men and, Nolan's Batman and all these things. So,
And look where that got us.
well, yes. Less of a focus, I find, on more, adult oriented films, I guess you could say, but I do still have a lot of nostalgia for this time period with the Oscars, especially, and just the films that were nominated in this decade. I have so many from this decade that I rate as some of my favorites, like Naomi Watts in Mulholland Drive, Judi Dench in Notes on a Scandal, Bjork and Dancer in the Dark, like a lot of the ones that I already mentioned for options for this year. I love a lot of the Kate Winslet performances, and she really dominated this decade. It just felt like a time where, even with, the mainstream stuff that I mentioned with superhero films and all that, there was still room for these kinds of dramas and such to generate discussion, I guess, and interest. And especially online, I feel like, there were a lot more voices by then talking about movies and awards. And I was on message boards like Gold Derby and things like that. And, Twitter was starting to emerge by the end of the decade. So I don't know. I wish we could maybe go back to those simpler times where it felt like, I wasn't fully poisoned by the internet. So
When it was still full of possibilities and promise.
Exactly. Yes. So, on that note, let us jump right into our very interesting first topic here. Isabelle Huppert in The Piano Teacher.
C'est pas une plaisanterie tout ce que je t'ai écrit, tu le sais. Dorénavant, c'est toi qui commandes. Dorénavant, c'est toi qui choisis ce que je vais mettre. C'est quoi ta couleur préférée? Tu me l'as pas encore dit. Tu me parles plus, t'es fâché?
So, I've obviously already mentioned or introduced Isabelle Huppert on the main show, talking about her nomination for Elle, but this is jumping back about 15 years earlier. So, to contextualize where Isabelle Huppert was at this point in her career, she was coming off a pretty good run in the 90s with films like Amateur and La Séparation and La Cérémonie, for which she won a César Award. And this is her first of multiple collaborations with Michael Haneke. This is an adaptation of the Nobel Prize-winning novel La Pianiste, and this is a French and Austrian film spoken in the French language. So Haneke only agreed to do the film if he could have Isabelle Huppert as the lead, which is fair, and she was very intrigued by the material, as you might expect, given her interest in these kind of complicated roles. So this is a psychological drama about a piano teacher named Erica, played, of course, by Isabelle, who is in her 30s and is still living with her overbearing mother. She is sexually repressed, and she seeks out satisfaction through voyeurism, watching porn in a video store, and things of that nature. And one day, she meets an attractive young student named Walter, who is also attracted to her, and they get together, at which point she reveals what she desires sexually, such as sadomasochism and, these kind of violent fantasies that initially scare him off, but he still keeps coming back to her. So, lots from there that we will explore later on, but let's get right into it here. This is a very thorny film and character, so tell me your thoughts on Isabelle Huppert overall as an actress, your relationship with her, and this performance, which, many people rank as one of her very best, if not her best.
I would certainly rank it in her top two. Not sure I'd put it first place. Because I'm a story of women truther. But I really love Isabelle Huppert. I think she is one of the most fascinating performers of our age. And we're just really lucky to be living at the same time that she's making cinema. In preparation to this, I was trying to remember what were the first films I watched Isabelle Huppert in. And it was interesting that you mentioned the 2000s in terms of the blogs and the discussions of film, because the 2006, 2007 award season was when as I said, I started following the Oscars, and it brought me to things like the film experience, where I now write for. And I remember being obsessed with things like Nathaniel Rogers' Film Bitch Awards. And I sort of used it as a guide to explore interesting performances, especially. And I remember seeing Isabelle Huppert in The Piano Teacher extremely praised, and also mentions of her in Eight Women. So if I recall correctly, those two and maybe I Heart Huckabees are sort of my entry points into Isabelle Huppert. And let me just say, for a tween come teenager, maybe those films aren't especially The Piano Teacher aren't the most understandable, but watching them at a tender age really left a lasting impression of fascination
Right.
and a bit of fear. She always
Yeah, there's always that.
a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that first impressions sort of informed a lot of the ways even today I engage with her. She is someone whose screen presence does inspire a certain awe, certain terrified awe, but also that fascination for someone who is so praised and recognized as one of the greats of our time in terms of acting. I think it's curious to note that she's not an especially demonstrative actress, or at least she's very controlled in how she demonstrates emotion. And I would almost sometimes would call her a minimalist in her approach to certain roles. But I think that plays into that fascination in that she's almost forcing us to lean into, pulling us forward into these characterizations that are often surprising, shocking, perverse, or even unknowable in a way that sort of gets under your skin. And that is certainly the case with The Piano Teacher, a character and performance that I first met as an alienating thing that I couldn't understand. And I feel that nowadays I can probably understand her a little bit better, but there is still I don't know if I would call it mystery. Mystery sounds a bit too mystic, but there is certainly an enigma of humanity that Huppert is able to conjure, and a strange mix of extreme vulnerability. She's great at playing fragility for someone that is so intimidating. Even if you go back to her early performances, like The Lacemaker is one of her first big acclaimed roles. It's a lot of her performance is about portraying the fragility of someone who can be so easily broken. But she's also great at frightening you, at being this strange, almost predatorial entity on screen that you're not sure what she's going to do, but you are scared that it will hurt you in some way. So I can completely understand why Anneke wanted her for the role, because it is difficult to imagine anyone else playing Erica, anyone with this very specific combination of evoking both fragility and the ability to be so utterly broken, but also this barbed wire soul that she has. And it is such an amazing performance, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like, even if I didn't completely understand it at the time, it made me a fan of hers for life. And even people who dislike this film tend to admire her. And I can't really imagine anyone witnessing The Piano Teacher and not being just in awe of what Huppert does in it.
I co-signed so much of what you just said there. But personally, for me, I did put off watching this for a long time because I was a little scared. I'm just going to be quite frank about it. I was a little like, am I ready for this? But eventually, when I did, I was like, this is challenging material here, but also so fascinating at the same time because it's really going to some dark, dark places. And to your point, there are very few actresses who could carry what Isabelle Huppert does here, and how she really just inhabits the role with so much clarity and, I don't know, like a context for how this person became the person that she is. even though we don't have flashbacks or anything like that, we get little hints of, her father being in a psychiatric hospital and things like that. And we see her relationship with her mother, and there's that. But it just feels like, she's done so much prep work in a way to make this character make sense, even when, she's doing some very questionable things. And to be fair, I don't even know how much she did prepare in the sort of traditional sense, because she's very matter of fact about this. Acting is a job for her, and she's not someone who, at least as publicly talked about, really doing a whole lot of like the whole method type of thing. But I can still feel the pain of who Erica is and how her life has kind of become this series of disappointments. And she, she exercises her control in her piano lessons and then in her sexual life, limited as it is. But she clearly is deeply unsatisfied with where she is at this point in her life. And I just love studying this character because she really makes you work for it to try to understand her, and maybe not fully empathize with her, but certainly understand where she's coming from. And I always appreciate that as an audience member. We kind of talked about this, me and Joyce, on the Anatomy of a Fall segment with Sandra Hüller, how we can always appreciate that kind of performance that isn't easily spoon-fed to us. Like, here are her motivations, here's what drives her. We kind of have to bring our own thoughts and, critical thinking skills to exactly what is driving her. And I think she and Hanukkah are really perfectly in sync with the vision. I think both of the performances we're talking about today, the actress and the director feel kind of symbiotic, I think, in that way.
To your point, I think it's important to note how one never feels like Huppert is trying to explain Erica.
Right.
She is, as you say, she is sort of inviting understanding, or at least daring you to try.
Yeah.
But she's not really explaining or solving Erica for us. Neither is Annika as a filmmaker. Even the way the film is shot, in these long takes, these very carefully composed shots, this sort of icy gleam to it. It's a very cold looking film, even without acknowledging its content or whatever. It is not forthcoming with its ideas or emotion. It really wants you to be looking at it as if through a pane of glass. But it I think it works best because of it, especially with how lurid some of the material is. It's almost bizarre to ponder that when we see Erica on her visit to the porn shop, where she goes into one of the cabins to watch pornography and smell the soiled tissues left by a man who was there before. I almost think the most destabilizing portion of that sequence is the people she bumps into as she's getting there, which is so bizarre. It almost reminds me of Jean Dillman, where the burnt dinner feels seismic in its impact, just because of what the synergy that is happening between the director and the material, but also the performer and the camera. Isabelle Huppert is completely in tune with Annika, with what he's doing. And, we can see that in their following collaborations, even in things that I don't think quite work, like Epi and in her in her tyrannical presidency of the Cannes jury that gave him his first Palme d'Or.
Yeah.
But, it's curious to think that so much of what I, at least now, found myself valuing about Huppert's performance are sometimes the mundane bits, like that knocking into people at the mall, or sort of the awkwardness when first meeting Walter, the way she always introduces her mother at functions. It's a performance about extremes of where we see her self-mutilating, where we see her again sniffing the soiled tissues of a man who just came in a porn booth, where we see her laid on the floor begging, where so much such extremes, but at the same time she grounds it all. It is such a careful negotiation. It's so impressive. And I sometimes think people are so caught up in the extremes of certain Huppert performances, like Elle, that they miss the fact that she can give you so much just by the matter of fact business of living in front of the camera, of her characters inhabiting the space. Like the way she moves in this film is fascinating to me. The scene where she's jealous and breaks a piece of glass and puts it in the coat of one of her students
Hmm.
is the way she and the camera are moving is almost dance like, even if when you're analyzing it coldly, it's very regimented, almost military, the way Erica moves through the space. This She's so purposeful with her movements. It's graceful and intimidating again, and it's that strange harmony that she captures in a lot of her performances, but especially here, where it seems weaponized to its most disturbing potential. I hope I'm
Yeah.
making sense.
Yeah, no, it's such a complicated character to get into with a lot of contradictions. And to that, the scene where she does ultimately meet Walter towards the beginning and is clearly taking a liking to him. It's just so fascinating to watch her face throughout all of that, because she's not really the kind of person who has that like easygoing charm at a party necessarily. So, after he's so like effusive in his praise of her playing and his appreciation of these old fashioned recitals and classical music, I just love watching her kind of analyzing him and trying to like figure out how to proceed from there, because she's not used to this kind of thing, I don't think. But she speaks with such authority there about her love of Schubert and Schulman and the different emotions that are expressed in a particular piece. And there is such confidence there and a lack of self-consciousness, maybe talking a little too much, a little too grandly, but she's just centered within herself, talking about what she knows best. And her interest in him isn't expressed in a super obvious way, but you can still see in her glances at him that there's something bubbling there, which I just appreciate the subtlety within that. And looking at the scenes of her like teaching piano, which can sometimes feel a bit frightening because she kind of inhabits the sort of stereotypical demanding teacher, right? Who's not easily impressed, who is pushing her students to like find the passion within the technique. And we see her staring out the window rather than actually looking at her students playing. Like, it is very intimidating in that classic Isabelle Huppert way that she can sort of do in her sleep. But she really rides the line of someone you do fear in a way, but also desperately want to impress or get the approval of. And from her, I think you're getting the sense of this being the place where she is in control of her life and liking that sense of control because she feels so stifled everywhere else.
Yes, and of course there is the relationship with her overbearing mother,
Yes.
which is one of the most disturbing parts of the film, this sort of perpetual infantilization that she has to endure at home. There is a real material difference in how she behaves when she's not under her mother's gaze or her mother's control. And you can almost see the gradations of self-possession, even when she's at home, when she's at a function with her mother, and when she's alone in a position of power. And the way you talk about the students and the audience feeling the need to impress her
Mm-hmm.
is curious, because as I was watching the film now with a lot more life experience, I became very aware of I don't know if I would call it contradictions within Erica's sexuality and her psychology. Because, like in BDSM, for example, in some ways the submissive partner is the one with the most control, because they're the ones that sort of define the rules of engagement, so to say, or when something starts and where something ends. There is a paradox of simultaneously giving up control, but at the same time being completely in charge of what is happening, defining the parameters of everything that will happen. You are at the same time you're staging your own powerlessness in some way.
Thank you for listening to this preview of A Woman Robbed, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is. If you liked what you heard and want to hear more, please go to patreon.com/andtherunnerup.is and become a patron. Only $3 a month will get you access to bonus episodes and early access to regular episodes. Thank you so much for your consideration.